In August 1982, security at the Playboy Mansion received something they had never seen before in 2 decades of parties, presidents, and protected excess: a written order, signed personally by Hugh Hefner. Do not admit, no explanations, not under any circumstances, even if he arrives with police. The name on the page belonged to an A-list Hollywood icon, a man who, less than a year earlier, had free access after midnight, his own security clearance, and a permanent seat at tables shared with studio heads and world leaders. His face had appeared on Playboy covers. His presence inside the mansion was once unquestioned. Overnight, he became the only person ever banned publicly. And permanently. No reason was given. Not to journalists, not to law enforcement, not even to staff who had known him for years. 6 months later, that same name surfaced inside a federal investigation that quietly reached into the mansion's past, an inquiry that came dangerously close to dismantling Playboy as a brand. The official explanation was never released, because whatever forced Hugh Hefner to put that order in writing was far more dangerous than scandal. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. He arrived without announcement, the way people do when they already belong somewhere. It was late 1969, one of those Los Angeles nights when the air around the hills stayed warm long after midnight. The gates of the Playboy Mansion West opened, not for a limousine with studio plates or a record producer's rolls, but for a dark sedan driven by someone else. The guards checked the face, not the car. They smiled, stepped aside, and logged nothing. Inside, the house moved on its own rhythm. Music from the main room, low laughter from the terrace, the constant quiet choreography of waitstaff who knew how not to look. The mansion was not a party. It was a system. People who understood that lasted. People who didn't were gone quickly, usually without ever realizing why. The actor understood it immediately. He was in his early 30s, already a box office certainty, already carrying himself like a man who had survived something rougher than fame. He spoke little, listened carefully, and never asked for what he wanted. Things simply began to happen around him. A couch cleared, a door stayed unlocked. A guard nodded and looked away. Within months, he was one of a handful allowed past the informal boundary known among staff as the family zone. No signs marked it. No rules explained it. You were either escorted out politely, or you were never stopped at all. He was never stopped. He stayed after the parties ended, when the mansion exhaled and the real conversations began. He watched rough cuts in the private screening room, sometimes alone, sometimes with Hugh Hefner seated a few rows back, robe loose, expression unreadable. On more than one occasion, Hefner made a call the next morning, smoothing a studio concern, nudging a contract forward at Warner Brothers. No favors were announced. They were simply understood. By 1972, the actor had his own access code, not a favor many even knew existed. He came and went at hours when the mansion belonged only to cleaners, security, and secrets. He brought energy with him, charisma, humor, the sense that something might happen just because he was there. Women gravitated toward him easily. Staff found him respectful. He tipped well. He never raised his voice, which is why the first irregularities felt like mistakes. A guest appeared without a badge. Then another. Security noted it, quietly, the way they noted everything. A playmate mentioned being uncomfortable after a late screening, then asked to forget she'd said anything. The internal service logged it and closed the note. No police. No paperwork. That was how problems were handled when the brand mattered more than the noise. When the reports reached Hefner's desk, they didn't look like threats. They looked like inconveniences attached to someone valuable. Hefner read them without comment, placed them in a folder that never officially existed, and gave a single instruction to his head of security. Not yet. In those years, the mansion still believed in itself. It believed its rules were stronger than law, its discretion safer than exposure. The actor fit perfectly into that belief. He laughed easily, moved freely, and never appeared dangerous. He looked like proof that the system worked. And that was the problem. Because by the time anyone realized he wasn't just enjoying the privileges, but studying them, it no longer felt possible to ask him to stop. By the mid-1970s, the mansion no longer slept between parties. It waited. Something subtle shifted in the corridors first. Staff began to recognize it not as an incident, but as a sensation, a tightening in the chest when certain doors stayed closed too long, when laughter came back thinner than it should have. The house still glittered, still photographed beautifully, but underneath the chandeliers, the rhythm changed. People started checking over their shoulders for reasons they couldn't explain. The first girl disappeared in early 1975. Not publicly, not dramatically. She simply stopped showing up for the closed events, the ones without photographers, without guest lists, without records. Her locker stayed untouched for weeks. Her name remained on internal schedules long after anyone expected her to return. When someone finally asked, the answer was vague and immediate. Personal reasons? Family emergency? Signed release. The explanation arrived too fast to feel true. The second disappearance came months later. This one left more noise behind it. A room left unfinished. Shoes by a service door. A cab receipt dated 3 hours after her shift ended. Security reviewed tapes that revealed nothing unusual, which itself felt unusual. The mansion prided itself on seeing everything. That night, it saw almost nothing at all. Then, unexpectedly, one of the girls resurfaced. She was found in Nevada under a different name, working quietly, living carefully. When contacted, she didn't ask for help or money. She asked only for distance. She refused to file a report. She refused to say where she'd been. Her voice, according to the staffer who spoke with her, sounded calm in a way that suggested rehearsal. Around the same time, security discovered something they had never encountered before. Staff badges that passed inspection but had never been issued. Perfect replicas. Correct codes. Wrong origin. They opened doors that should have required supervision. Whoever carried them moved freely, unseen by design. Tracing them led to a dead end, and then, reluctantly, to a familiar name. The actor. Not directly, not on paper, but in patterns. Guests who entered with him. Corridors accessed shortly after his arrival. A consistency that felt intentional. When internal security tried to flag it, the report stalled. It didn't reach Hefner. It didn't reach legal. It lived in a quiet space between responsibility and fear. So they started something unofficial. A file without a title. Notes without signatures. Audio fragments labeled with dates instead of names. Accounts from former staff who no longer wanted their voices attached to anything permanent. The picture that emerged wasn't criminal in the obvious sense. It was colder. The actor wasn't using the mansion for pleasure alone. He was using it as leverage. Private meetings. Introductions arranged away from main rooms. Conversations held where walls had learned to forget. Powerful people came and went, believing they were invisible. He made no threats. He asked no questions. He simply remembered. For the first time, the mansion felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mechanism, one that could apply pressure without ever touching you. Among the staff, a thought began to circulate without being spoken aloud. What if the house was no longer fully controlled by the man who built it? Hefner still walked the halls, still hosted dinners, still projected confidence. But decisions were now being made beyond his immediate sight. Systems he trusted were acting independently. The fear wasn't of scandal yet. It was of realizing that someone else had learned how to use the mansion the way it was never meant to be used. Quietly, patiently, and without asking permission. The folder was never meant to be assembled. It existed because too many small things refused to stay separate. By 1979, the Internal Service had stopped pretending it was merely observing. What began as margin notes turned into dates, then into sequences. 11 points in total. No dramatic headings. No accusations. Just material. Enough of it that no single page explained the others. But together, they formed something heavy. There were audio fragments first. Not confessions. Conversations caught at the edges. Voices lowered when a door closed. Names mentioned without context. Pauses that suggested someone else was listening. Then photographs, taken without faces, centered, always slightly off-angle. Rooms recognizable only to those who knew the house well. Private rooms. Times when no guests should have been present. Statements followed. Former staff. Former girls. Each insisted on one condition. Nothing goes to police. Nothing public. Their accounts didn't describe violence. They described pressure. Being redirected. Being told when to stay, when to leave, when forgetting would be safer than remembering. The most troubling pages connected the actor's name to people already appearing in federal filings elsewhere. Campaign donors, producers under quiet scrutiny, men whose reputations were intact only because the right stories had never found a microphone. The mansion, unintentionally, sat at the intersection. The file was prepared carefully. No opinions, no recommendations, just evidence arranged to make denial difficult. When the head of Internal Security requested time with Hefner, the meeting never happened. The folder didn't reach his desk. It was intercepted by people who believed they were protecting him. Advisors who understood that once something was known, it could no longer be unknown. They argued discretion, timing, brand exposure. The file was locked away, labeled pending, and effectively buried. Hefner learned about it by accident. A journalist, someone he had known for years, mentioned it casually over lunch. Not the contents, just the rumor of a file circulating inside his own house. Something about a list. Something about an actor. Something that sounded too organized to be gossip. That night, Hefner demanded to see it. He was shown one page, only one. It was enough. He didn't read it twice. He didn't ask who compiled it. He didn't ask how long it had existed. The expression that crossed his face wasn't anger. It was recognition. The look of a man who understands that a line has been crossed without permission. 48 hours later, a decision moved through the mansion faster than any party invitation ever had. Security received a sealed directive. Access codes were erased. Names were removed from internal systems. Guards were instructed not to argue, not to explain, not to escalate. If the actor arrived, he was to be turned away politely, firmly, permanently. No announcement was made, no statement prepared. The word ban was never spoken aloud. For the first time in the mansion's history, a guest wasn't phased out or discouraged. He was closed out completely. Hefner didn't justify it. He didn't soften it. He simply shut the door. Not as a host, but as a man protecting something larger than reputation. The file returned to storage. The house exhaled again. But the silence that followed was different. It wasn't relief. It was the sound of consequences beginning to move. He didn't hear about the ban from the gate. That would have been too humiliating, too final. Instead, The news reached him through a producer he trusted, a man who spoke carefully, choosing words as if they might later be replayed. The call lasted less than a minute. There was no explanation offered, only a sentence delivered with forced calm: "You shouldn't come by anymore." For 72 hours, nothing happened. That silence mattered. It told him this wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed out over dinner. It was structural. Someone had moved him from inside to outside without asking for his response. Then he began to move. The first calls went to women he hadn't spoken to in years. Former playmates. Familiar voices softened by time. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He reminded them of nights they all remembered differently, of promises that had been made without witnesses, of favors that could still be returned. One of them hung up. The other listened without agreeing to anything, which was enough. Next came the journalist. Not a tabloid writer. Someone serious. Someone whose editor liked stories that hinted rather than exploded. The actor framed it as concern, not grievance. He spoke about excess, about blurred lines, about places where powerful men forgot how visible they were. He never mentioned names. He didn't need to. Anyone who had ever driven past the gates knew exactly which house he meant. Inside Playboy Inc., the first sign of trouble wasn't an article. It was a leak. Details appeared in a draft that shouldn't have existed outside internal circles. Descriptions of rooms. Schedules from the late 70s. A reference to a night in 1976 that had been sealed so completely most employees didn't know it had happened. Whoever was feeding the information hadn't guessed. They had known. That changed everything. Hefner read the briefing alone. No robe this time, no entourage, just pages laid out cleanly, the way lawyers prefer when they want a decision rather than a discussion. He understood the shape of it immediately. This wasn't revenge. It was insurance being activated. The actor had never seen himself as a guest. He had been documenting an ecosystem, learning which secrets carried weight and which ones collapsed under daylight. He had stayed quiet, not because he was harmless, but because silence gave him options. For the first time, Hefner acknowledged what he was facing. This wasn't a scandal waiting to break. It was a threat calibrated to destroy selectively. The actor didn't sound desperate when he spoke to intermediaries. He sounded offended. He believed access was a right he had earned. He believed closing the door was an insult that required correction. And he believed that enough people would be afraid of the past to help him reopen it. Hefner didn't respond publicly. He didn't counterleak. He didn't negotiate. But the mansion changed. Old privileges were quietly revoked. Guest lists tightened. Even longtime friends noticed doors closing sooner than they used to. Conversations shortened. The house wasn't panicking. It was consolidating. The actor mistook the quiet for hesitation. What he didn't see was the recalculation happening behind it. A man who had built an empire on pleasure, now measuring risk with the precision of someone who understood loss. For the first time since the ban, Hefner allowed himself a private admission. This wasn't about keeping one man out. It was about whether the entire structure could survive someone who believed he was untouchable. The first contact did not arrive with letterhead. It came as a request phrased like a courtesy. A quiet inquiry routed through corporate counsel, marked informal, unsigned. No warrant, no accusations, just interest. Federal interest, the kind that never explained itself but expected to be taken seriously. By early 1983, Playboy Inc. understood the tone immediately. This was not law enforcement looking for headlines. This was something slower, heavier. The request referenced 3 elements only: The band actor, two elected officials whose names never appeared together in print, and a private gathering at the mansion from the late 70s. One night. No description. No conclusions. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had connected dots that were never meant to align. Internal meetings followed, stripped of ceremony. Lawyers spoke in hypotheticals. Executives avoided eye contact. Everyone knew the danger wasn't prosecution. It was exposure. The Federals weren't asking about Hugh Hefner. They weren't interested in Playboy's public face. They wanted the archives, the silent memory of the house. Hefner listened more than he spoke. He was told cooperation could protect the brand. That phrase landed with unusual weight. It meant immunity for some things, sacrifice for others. It meant deciding which truths survived and which ones disappeared quietly into locked rooms. What complicated everything was timing. Before Playboy formally responded, word reached the actor. Earlier than it should have. Earlier than anyone could explain. Someone, somewhere, had warned him that federal attention was shifting in his direction. Not because of the mansion, but because of something adjacent to it. A separate case. Separate witnesses. Overlapping names. The actor reacted with speed, not fear. He stopped calling journalists. He stopped pressing intermediaries. He began repositioning himself, signaling distance from anything that could be framed as institutional. His silence wasn't retreat. It was calculation. Hefner recognized that instinct. He had used it himself for decades. Then he made a decision that startled even his closest advisors. He ordered selective destruction. Not recklessly. Not emotionally. Entire categories of internal records vanished. Notes that had no legal standing. Recordings never meant to exist. Schedules that implicated people who had never consented to be part of any narrative. What remained was deliberate, clean, defensive. Most importantly, it protected the women. Whatever had happened within the mansion's walls, Hefner refused to let unnamed girls become collateral damage in a conflict they had never agreed to fight. If truth required sacrificing them, then truth would wait. What stayed in the archive was enough to sever the actor permanently, enough to ensure no door reopened, enough to show federal eyes that cooperation had limits. There were no heroes in that moment, only choices shaped by survival. The Federals understood what they were being offered. They didn't object. They adjusted. The inquiry cooled without resolution, the way such things often do when no one benefits from clarity. The actor, cut off from leverage on all sides, felt the ground shift beneath him. He was no longer ahead of the system. He was inside it, subject to its patience. The mansion remained standing, but it was no longer innocent about what it had narrowly avoided. By the mid-1980s, the actor understood what had happened to him. The federal silence was not confusion. It was exclusion. Whatever protection he thought he had built through proximity and memory no longer applied. The mansion was sealed to him, not symbolically, but operationally. No intermediaries, no back channels, no favors that could be called in quietly. For a man who had lived on access, that was the real punishment. So he turned to the only arena where he still believed he could control the narrative. Television. The interview was framed as a confession without a crime. A long, carefully negotiated sit-down with a respected host, marketed as a meditation on fame, excess, and the unseen costs of Hollywood's golden years. He agreed to one condition only: no direct names, no institutions, just experience. He spoke calmly, too calmly. He described a house in the hills where rules dissolved after midnight. He spoke of young women who arrived believing they were safe, and left unsure what they were allowed to remember. He talked about power moving through corridors like a current, invisible, dangerous, impossible to resist. Anyone watching knew exactly which place he meant. The reaction was immediate, but uneven. Some journalists circled the story, waiting for confirmation. Others sharpened headlines that never quite crossed the line into accusation. Viewers debated. Insiders stayed silent. Playboy did not respond. No statement, no denial, no clarification. That absence unsettled people more than outrage would have. Silence implied confidence or indifference. Both were dangerous. Behind closed doors, changes accelerated. Long-standing guests lost access without explanation. Party formats shifted. Private events disappeared entirely. Archival material was restricted to a handful of trusted custodians. The mansion began to feel less like a playground and more like a controlled environment, designed to remember only what it chose to preserve. Months passed. Then consequences arrived without announcement. A major studio quietly withdrew from a project the actor had been attached to for over a year. No public fallout, just a scheduling conflict that never resolved. Another role stalled in development, then vanished. Meetings stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up. No one told him why. He began to realize the pattern wasn't punishment. It was removal. He wasn't being attacked. He was being excluded from systems that no longer trusted him. That was when it became clear. The interview hadn't weakened Hefner. It had confirmed his strategy. By refusing to engage publicly, Hefner had denied the actor what he needed most: escalation. There was no visible enemy to fight, no scandal to sharpen into relevance. Just closed doors and unanswered messages. The actor had played a long game, collecting moments like currency. But he had misjudged the final rule of the house he once thought he understood. Information only mattered if the system agreed to acknowledge it. And now, it didn't. The mansion still hosted, still entertained, still projected allure. But it did so with a new restraint, shaped by lessons learned too late to forget. The actor remained visible, technically successful, publicly intact. Yet he could feel it. The quiet recalibration of a world that no longer needed him inside its walls. By the early 1990s, the story no longer belonged to the public. Time had softened the outlines. New scandals replaced old whispers. The mansion endured, quieter now, more measured. Many of the people who once moved through its rooms were gone. Retired, relocated, erased by the industry's short memory. What remained was an archive that almost no one accessed, and a question that had never been answered out loud. In 1992, a former member of the mansion's internal security agreed to speak. Not to a reporter, not to a court, but to the archive itself. A recorded deposition stored with materials never intended for release. No payment, no anonymity demanded. Just the need to place something somewhere safe before age did what pressure had not. He explained that the ban had never been about a single night. There was no defining crime, no moment that could be quoted cleanly. What triggered the final decision was pattern recognition, the realization that one guest had violated the only rule that truly mattered inside the mansion. The one never written down, because writing it would have made it real. You did not collect, not leverage, not protection, not stories meant to outlive the room they were told in. The house survived on selective forgetting. Anyone who treated memory as a weapon endangered everyone inside it. The actor hadn't gathered information to destroy Playboy. That was the irony. He had been building insurance against other men, politicians, financiers, producers, people powerful enough to ruin him if he misstepped. The mansion was simply the safest place to observe them unguarded. If that system had surfaced publicly, the damage would not have landed on the famous. It would have landed on the women, unnamed, unprotected, forever linked to moments they never consented to document. Hefner understood that before anyone else did. Making the reason public would have satisfied curiosity, but destroyed lives. Silence was not avoidance. It was containment. The ban, the guard said, was never punishment. It was a circuit breaker. By removing one man quietly, Hefner prevented a cascade he knew he couldn't control once it began. The price was ambiguity. The reward was that nothing exploded. In 1993, near the end of one long evening, Hefner sat in the private screening room alone, except for one aide. An old film played without sound, its images flickering across his face. He watched for several minutes before speaking, his voice low, almost reflective. "Some people aren't expelled," he said. "They're just no longer allowed to exist inside the story." No explanation followed. None was needed. The official reason was never released, because any official reason would have been a lie, or worse, a truth that harmed the wrong people. The mansion kept its doors. The archive kept its silence. And the ban remained what it had always been. Not an ending, but a restraint placed on something far more dangerous than scandal.